Wyoming Territory, July 1882. The sun beat hard on the town of Laramie as the courthouse bell rang noon, but no one looked up. All eyes were fixed on the woman being dragged by her upper arms across the packed dirt toward the courthouse steps, her white muslin dress streaked in dust, and her dark hair falling loose from its pins. "Let go of me," she yelled, kicking her heels into the ground. "You have no right." The two men pulling her didn't speak. Their hands were rough, their coats city clean. One wore a tin star crooked on his vest. They were not lawmen. Not really. Just hired hands paid by Judge Ellerby to see through a marriage contract signed without the bride's consent. The woman's name was Pearl Aniston. She was 23, a teacher's daughter from Illinois. Her father had passed 2 winters ago, and with no male kin to speak for her, she'd been lured west with the promise of work and land. What she got instead was a contract she'd never seen, and a man twice her age claiming her as his fiancé. She kicked again, catching one man in the shin. He cursed and yanked her forward. "You're gonna marry Mr. Dole whether you like it or not." Judge Ellerby signed off, and that means it's legal. "I will not marry that man," she shouted, eyes wild, voice shaking. "He bought that paper with lies." Then the sound of hooves thundered down the street, louder than the murmurs of the watching crowd. A tall man in a dust-covered hat rode hard around the corner, pulling his horse to a stop just feet from the steps. He dismounted in one leap. "Let her go," he said, his voice low but clear. The men turned, startled. The cowboy stood straight, his hat shadowing his eyes. He looked like dust and danger. He had a rifle strapped to his saddle and a look in his eyes that said he'd use it if he had to. Pearl blinked, stunned. "Nash," he looked at her, then really looked, and something in his face softened. "Pearl, you all right?" She nodded once, breath catching. "Better now." The man with the tin star stepped forward. "This ain't your business, cowboy." Nash Carver didn't move. "It is now." Pearl's knees buckled as the other man dragged her up another step. Nash stepped forward fast, catching her around the waist. He lifted her off the ground like she weighed nothing, holding her close. "She's already taken," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The crowd went still. Pearl stared up at him, stunned. "What are you saying?" He looked down at her, the edge of a smile pulling at his mouth. "I'm saying you're mine, Pearl, if you still want that." Her heart stuttered. "You left. I came back." The men hesitated, unsure now. The tin star man squinted. "You got proof of a claim." Nash's voice was steady. "We grew up together in Illinois. I was 18 and she was 15 when I first told her I'd marry her someday. Her father said no, said I needed land first. I got it now. 60 acres outside Cheyenne. 2 horses and a barn near built. That enough of a claim for you?" Pearl's voice was barely a whisper. "You remembered." "I never forgot." The tin star looked at the other man. "Let's go." They released her, muttering curses, and backed down the steps. Nash didn't let go of her. He helped her down slowly, step by step, until they stood together on the street. Her hands trembled as she looked at him. "You actually came back." He touched her cheek. "I never stopped thinking about you, Pearl. I just had to build a life worth bringing you into." She swallowed hard, tears in her eyes. "You saved me." He shook his head. "You saved me first, long before I ever left." The crowd began to drift away, whispers trailing behind them. Nash helped her to his horse, lifting her gently into the saddle before mounting behind her. As they rode out of town, Pearl leaned back against him. "You really have land." "Sure do." "And a barn." "Halfway up. You can help me finish it." She smiled through her tears. "I'd like that." They rode in silence a while, the prairie stretching wide around them. The wind picked up, warm and dry, carrying the scent of grass and dust and something that felt a lot like freedom. After a while she said, You know, I was beginning to believe I didn't belong to anyone anymore. He pulled her closer. You always belonged to me. I just had to remind you. Pearl closed her eyes and leaned her head against his shoulder. She believed him. The road east from Laramie turned to rutted trail within 5 miles, winding through low hills dotted with sage and wind-bent cottonwoods. The sun had begun its slow climb down when Nash guided his mare into the narrow pass that led to his homestead. Pearl sat steady in front of him, her back warm against his chest, her hands clasped around the saddle horn. She hadn't said much since they left town, and neither had he. The silence between them was not strained, just full of things not yet spoken. The trail curved, and suddenly the house came into view. It was small but solid, built of square-hewn logs with a sloped roof and a deep porch. Smoke curled from a stovepipe. A lean tosht stood to one side, and beyond it stretched a fenced pasture with 2 chestnut geldings grazing. The half-finished barn sat at the far edge of the property, its frame stark against the sky. Nash dismounted first, then helped her down. Her boots touched dry grass and she stood still, looking. "You built this yourself?" she asked, voice quiet but steady. "Every board except the roof joists. Neighbor helped me raise those last spring." Pearl stepped forward. The porch creaked beneath her weight. She ran her hand along the railing, then turned toward him. "You really meant for me to come here with you, didn't you?" He untied the saddlebag and slung it over his shoulder. "I wouldn't have come back if I didn't." She looked toward the barn, then the hills beyond. "It's beautiful." He nodded, then added, "It's still rough, no glass in the windows yet. I've been using oilcloth." "I don't need glass," she said, and her mouth tilted up just slightly. "Just a place where no one can sell me like a mule." His jaw tightened. "That won't ever happen again, not while I'm breathing." Pearl stepped off the porch and walked slowly toward the pasture. The horses lifted their heads but didn't spook. She stopped beside the fence and rested her arms on the top rail. Nash came up beside her, setting the saddlebag down. "You hungry?" She hesitated. "I haven't eaten since early morning. I've got dried venison, beans left from last night. I can heat 'em up." Pearl looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You always this steady, Nash Carver? Or is this just for me?" He met her gaze. "A man's got no business asking a woman to share his life if his hands don't match his words." That brought a long pause. Then she said, "I left behind everything I was told would keep me safe. Every rule I followed brought me closer to that courthouse. And what I've got to offer isn't much," he said, "but it's real." She nodded slowly and her voice dropped. "I'd rather have real." They went inside. The house smelled of dry cedar and smoke. Inside was plain. A table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot with wool blankets, a battered trunk pushed against the wall. The cookstove gave off a low heat. While Nash unpacked the saddlebag, Pearl hovered near the hearth, her eyes moving over the space. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, the window frame, the shelf where a tin of coffee and a jar of lard stood side by side. She didn't speak, but there was something unspoken in the way she moved, as if mapping the edges of this new life. He handed her a tin bowl. "Hope you don't mind it plain." She took it. "I've eaten worse." They sat across from one another, spoons scraping quiet into the room. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing the smell of rain from the west. After they'd eaten, Pearl stood and walked to the door. She opened it and looked out at the horizon, where the sky had taken on the color of bruised lilac. "You remember the letter you sent?" she asked without turning. Nash leaned back in his chair. "Every word. You said you'd found something here that made you feel like you could breathe again." He stood, walked to the doorway, and stopped beside her. It wasn't the land. Pearl turned her head toward him. The quiet between them deepened, thicker than silence, softer than sound. His hand brushed hers, slow and deliberate. She didn't pull away. She said, "I don't need a promise, just a place I can belong." He looked at her, not as he had in town, fierce and sure, but with something gentler behind his eyes. "You already do." Pearl let her hand find his. She held it, firm and sure, as the wind moved across the grass and the first drops of rain tapped softly against the roof above them. Pearl woke before the light reached the window. The air inside the cabin was cool, still touched with the scent of last night's rain, and for a long moment she lay still, her eyes fixed on the rough-hewn ceiling above. She hadn't dreamed, not really, just flickers of voices, distant places. But she hadn't woken afraid. That, she realized, was new. She rose quietly and crossed to the wash basin, the floor chill beneath her bare feet. Her dress from yesterday hung near the hearth, still damp at the hem. She found one of Nash's shirts folded neatly atop the trunk and pulled it over her head. It reached her knees, the sleeves falling long past her wrists. Outside, the world was soft and gray. Mist lay low over the pasture and the horses were still. A meadowlark called once, then fell silent again. She stepped onto the porch and sat, wrapping her arms around her knees, watching the pale light stretch across the land. Nash emerged from the barn not long after. A hammer looped through his belt, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He stopped when he saw her, one boot on the porch step, and something in his face eased. "You slept all right," Pearl nodded. "Better than I expected." "I've got coffee started," he said. "It's not fancy, but it does the job." She smiled faintly. "I used to think I needed a parlor with lace curtains. Now I think I just needed quiet." He walked up the steps and set the hammer down by the door. "Quiet's not hard to come by out here. It's the staying that takes work." Pearl looked out across the field. "What made you stay?" He sat beside her, rubbing the calluses on his palm. "After my pa died, I drove freight out of Fort Collins. Rode 6 straight months down to Raton Pass and back. Never slept in the same bed twice. One morning I woke up beside the trail with frost in my beard and couldn't remember what month it was. That's when I knew I was done running." She didn't speak right away. "I used to picture you in a city, somewhere with gas lamps and polished boots." He chuckled low in his throat. "I tried Denver once. Lasted 2 weeks, couldn't stand the noise." Pearl turned toward him. "You ever get lonely out here?" He paused. "I did. Until yesterday." She looked away quickly, but not before he saw the color rise in her cheeks. Inside, the coffee pot hissed. Nash rose and went to pour 2 tin cups, returning with them balanced in one hand. He gave her the warmer one. She sipped and winced slightly. "Still strong as I remember. Boiled twice, just like my ma taught. Burns the bitterness out." Pearl rested the cup against her leg, steam curling past her face. "I've only ever known how to teach arithmetic and sew a straight hem. I don't know how to mend fences or plant rows or trap gophers. You don't need to know everything today." She looked at him, serious now. "What if I never do?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then we learn together. I've never roofed a barn without swearing. Doesn't mean I stop nailing boards." The air between them shifted, a quiet thread pulling taut. Pearl reached down and brushed a bit of dried grass from her ankle. "There's a reverend in Cheyenne. He married the couple down the ridge last spring." "I know him," Nash said. "Name's Elwood. Doesn't talk much, but he's fair." She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Would he come here? If I rode in this morning, he'd be here by tomorrow evening." Pearl took a long breath, then nodded once. "Then ride." Nash didn't reach for her, didn't move fast. He just looked at her and said, "All right." He stood, finished his coffee in one swallow, and grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. Before mounting, he turned and said, "You'll be all right here while I'm gone." She stood too, pulling his shirt tighter around her. "I'm not afraid anymore, Nash." He touched the brim of his hat, then swung up into the saddle and rode out without another word. Pearl stood at the fence line until the shape of him blurred into the horizon. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin, her bare feet brushing dew from the grass, her heart steady in her chest. Pearl stood at the wooden table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, kneading dough with quiet concentration. The flour was coarse, the yeast weak from travel, but it would hold. She worked slow, pressing the heel of her hand into the soft weight, folding it again and again. The chill of morning had lifted, and the cabin had taken on the warm scent of rising bread and stove heat. Through the open window, the sun climbed higher over the pasture. A hawk circled wide above the ridge, its shadow gliding across the grass. She glanced at it once, then turned back to her task. Her hands moved with rhythm, steady and sure, though her thoughts ran elsewhere. She'd found a stack of letters beneath the cot earlier, thin pages, folded twice and bound with a strip of rawhide. She hadn't opened them. The handwriting was his. She tucked them back where she found them, untouched. Some things, she figured, would come in time. She covered the dough with a damp cloth and stepped outside. The porch boards creaked under her step, and the light caught the edge of a tin basin she'd left to fill with rain. She picked it up, poured the water into the wash bucket, and crouched beside the stoop to scrub the dirt from her hem. Her fingers worked through the fabric, stiff from dried mud and courthouse dust. A flicker of movement caught her eye. Someone was coming up the trail, not Nash, but a woman on a mule, riding slow. Pearl stood, wiping her hands on the back of her skirt. The rider dismounted stiffly and tied the reins to the fence post. "You Pearl Aniston?" the woman asked. "I am." The woman tucked a loose braid beneath her kerchief. "Name's Etta Malone. My boy works cattle near the Sweetwater. Said a man came through Cheyenne yesterday asking after a reverend. Thought maybe it was worth seeing who he was marrying." Pearl stepped off the porch. "He's expected back by tonight." Etta's eyes swept the cabin, the line of laundry strung between posts, the faint curls of smoke from the stovepipe. "You set this up in a hurry." "I didn't plan on it," Pearl said. "But it was time," Etta nodded. "I brought a sack of cornmeal, figured you might be starting low." Pearl walked to meet her, taking the sack. "I appreciate it. You got anyone coming for the vows?" "No kin left. Nash is all." The older woman studied her a moment. "You got the look of someone who's had to start over more than once." Pearl didn't answer. Etta gave a short breath through her nose, not quite a laugh. "All right. I'll come back this evening and stand for you if you need a witness." Pearl's voice was soft. "Thank you." Etta swung into the saddle. "If the man rides the way my boy says he does, you'll hear him long before you see him." Pearl watched her go, the rhythm of hoofbeats fading into the hills. By afternoon, she'd scrubbed the floorboards, trimmed the wick on the lamp, and stacked the last of the chopped firewood beneath the porch overhang. Sweat dampened the collar of her borrowed shirt, and her hair clung in pieces to the back of her neck. She tied it up with a strip of muslin and stood at the doorway, watching the sky for movement. The sound came low at first, hoofbeats, distant, growing steady. She stepped down into the yard, dust rising around her boots. A moment later, Nash crested the ridge, riding toward her with the sun behind him. Another rider followed, tall, lean, with a long black coat and a prayer book slung in a leather pouch. Nash dismounted and crossed to her without hesitation. His coat was open, collar dark with sweat, and his hand found hers without asking. "He agreed to come," he said. "I see that." The Reverend dismounted, removed his hat, and nodded. "Miss Aniston, Mr. Carver." Pearl's grip on Nash's hand tightened slightly. "We're ready." The sun dipped low as the words were spoken. Nash's voice didn't waver. Pearl's didn't either. The wind moved soft through the grass, and behind them the cabin stood clean and waiting. The Reverend spoke plainly, without flourish, and when it was done, Etta handed Pearl a small sprig of sage she'd tied with twine. Pearl looked up at Nash. "You sure about this?" His answer was quiet. "More sure than anything I've ever done." She leaned in, her forehead against his. "Then let's begin." They turned toward the house together, hand in hand, with the last of the sunlight catching the edge of the porch. The door stood open. The bread had risen, and inside the table was set for two. The sun had long since settled behind the horizon when Nash banked the fire and bolted the door. Outside, the land had gone quiet in the way only the prairie could. No wind, no birds, just the hush of night pressing close. The single oil lamp on the table threw a soft glow across the cabin, catching the worn grain of the wood and casting gentle shadows on the walls. Pearl stood at the shelf, folding the towel she'd used to dry the tin plates. Her hands moved carefully, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She turned when she heard him cross the room. "I've been thinking," she said, meeting his eyes in the half-light. "We ought to turn that lean-to into a proper kitchen. It'd free up space in here." Nash leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, arms loosely crossed. "You've been here 2 days and already planning improvements." Her expression didn't change, but the corner of her mouth lifted slightly. "I've never had anything to improve before." He stepped forward and took the towel from her hands, setting it aside. "Tell me what you want built first." She studied his face, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his brow softened beneath the brim of his hat. "A root cellar, then a chicken coop, a real stove if we can find one. We'll trade for one come fall. I've got 2 cords of pine I was planning to haul down to the station. That should fetch enough." Pearl glanced at the empty corner near the window. "I could set a table there, with shelves above for jars and preserves." "You planning to stay long enough to fill shelves?" She stepped closer, her voice steady. "I married you because I meant to stay, not because I had nowhere else to go." Nash reached for her hand, his fingers calloused, warm. "I know. I just like hearing you say it out loud." Pearl let herself lean against him, her cheek resting just below his collarbone. He smelled faintly of horses and cedar smoke. She felt his breath rise and fall beneath her cheek, slow and even. "I used to think I'd have a life with lace curtains and silver teaspoons," she murmured. "Turns out I prefer a man who can build a barn with his own 2 hands." He kissed the top of her head, quiet and sure. "You'll have lace if you want it, or chickens, or both." Pearl looked up at him. "I want what we've got now. The rest can come slow." Later, when the lamp was turned down and the fire gone to embers, they lay together beneath the thick wool blanket, bodies warm from shared heat. He traced the inside of her wrist with the back of his finger, slow and absent. She watched the shadows flicker across the ceiling. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked, voice low. "Which part?" "That I belong to you." Nash's voice came without hesitation. "I did, and I still do." She turned to face him fully. "Then I guess we belong to each other." He didn't speak, just pulled her close until her breath matched his own. The days that followed settled into rhythm. Nash rose with the sun, feeding the horses and checking the lines along the fence. Pearl swept out the cabin, sorted the seed sacks, and sketched out plans for the kitchen addition in the back of an old ledger book he'd saved from town. Etta returned once, bringing a basket of early apples and a length of muslin for curtains. "You're making something of yourselves," she said, nodding at the sawhorses and stacked lumber near the barn. "We'll be needing school again come fall. You think on it." Pearl accepted the apples with a grateful smile but said nothing then. That evening she mentioned it to Nash while they shelled peas on the porch. "I might take her up on it," she said, glancing toward the ridgeline. "It'd be good to use my mind again in that way." Nash nodded. "You'd be good for it." The kids around here need someone who listens before they talk. She reached for another pod, her hands moving without pause. I used to think I'd be a wife or a teacher, never knew I could be both. You're more than either, he said. You're the heart of this place now. She didn't answer, just leaned her shoulder against his and let the silence stretch around them like a warm blanket. By the time the first frost came, the barn roof stood finished and the lean-to had become a proper kitchen, with a clay hearth and a chimney Nash built stone by stone. Pearl's shelves held jars of pickled beans, stewed apples, and half a dozen tins of dried summer herbs. Etta's muslin had become curtains after all pale blue, tied back with twine. They never spoke of the courthouse or the men who had dragged her there. There was no need. The past had its place, but it no longer stood between them. Pearl's hands were calloused now, her arms strong from lifting, digging, building. Nash still rode the fence line each morning, but every evening he returned to her, boots at the door, arms open. One night, as the snow began to dust the ground, he brought in a cedar branch he'd cut from the edge of the woods and set it in a water bucket near the hearth. Pearl hung 3 small ribbons from it, red and fraying. She didn't say where they'd come from, and Nash didn't ask. They sat beside it that night, sharing a blanket and the last of the cider. The wind howled outside, but the cabin held firm. When he reached for her hand, she laced their fingers together without hesitation. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. He looked at her, then at the fire. "Only that I didn't come back sooner." Pearl rested her head against his shoulder. "You came when it mattered most." They stayed like that until the fire burned low, and the world outside was blanketed in white. Inside, the warmth lingered, not just from the hearth, but from the steadiness they'd built every beam, every word, every quiet moment stitched together into something neither of them had ever known before. And in that small, solid house on the edge of the Wyoming hills, Pearl Aniston and Nash Carver lived the kind of life that didn't need lace curtains or silver spoons. Just shared work, long days, deeper love, and the knowledge that they'd found in each other a home that would hold.